There's so many websites out there with source code available for anyone to look at or learn from, but it's not always accessible or easily understood. So we wanted to address this issue in several ways. My project in particular is motivated by the fact that there are often common trends in web design, layout or component based, like background videos or the one template that everyone seems to use for their startup website. But we don't yet have tools to really survey and understand these differences across websites. So for more experienced programmers, it's often not just a concern for getting things to work, but really understanding why one particular way of structuring their code is preferable to other ways, even though they might all have the same visual outcome. So my research question for this quarter was, how can we help somewhat experienced programmers learn from the comparison of implementations of similar components or layouts across multiple websites? So given a similar visual outcome, how can we understand why implementations make certain decisions and extract high-level insights that can help learners in their own projects? So we conducted 2 rounds of need finding to understand how learners and programmers use real-world examples in their own work, why they do so, at what stage, and also maybe why they don't. What are the challenges that they find with that? So what we learned in this in our need finding was that it's really hard from just the source code, like so, that might just be really, really daunting, to see how a project or a component or a layout really comes all together. And oftentimes what people end up doing is when they try to replicate features, they just look for things that look anything remotely similar to what they're working on, copy those, paste them into their own editor, and then sort of strip away what is unnecessary. So it ends up being pretty tedious in terms of trying to get rid of additional code that needs to be pared down or whittled away before it really becomes useful. And oftentimes it's just really overwhelming to try and translate someone else's code, oftentimes for much larger scale websites, to a smaller scale project. It's also difficult because for a lot of learners noted that it depends on a project structure or certain libraries that real world examples might be using. For example, there's 1,000 ways to do grids, but finding the right one that suits their own needs can be quite difficult. So what I ended up building is a Node app that uses Cheerio and Fridge to scrape HTML and CSS of components across several websites, and uses CodeMirror and regular JavaScript for layout and just extracting some high-level information about each of these sites' implementations. So what I've done here is just have various navigation bars across several websites, New Yorker, NPR, and New York Times, and the accompanying CSS for each, and just to demonstrate with some syntax highlighting for classes and IDs in the HTML, and also just a really basic overview of comparing them. So we can see that just in terms of pure line count to implement this, the New Yorker only takes 48 lines, and the New York Times is a couple thousand. And so for a very initial study, I just showed this prototype with these specific affordances, like code highlighting with code collapsing features, a live screenshot of what the component actually looks like across these different websites, and also this sort of high-level comparison of all three to a few users, and just asked for their general impressions of whether or not they would find this useful, what aspects or affordances they don't see here that they would want to see, and additional sort of just high-level directions that or applications that they could imagine using this tool in their own lives. And so what I learned from this initial study was that people generally really found the syntax highlighting and overall layout of this page helpful, having having the highlighting and using the code mirror layout, they said, presented more information at once than what Chrome DevTools would otherwise do, which is often sort of toggling and fumbling through a lot of different levels of code and then seeing how another pane for CSS updates. Live editing and updating was a really important feature that they wanted to see, just because for a lot of, again, proficient developers, Chrome DevTools is one of the most commonly used tools for debugging and sort of testing code before you actually write it. And so providing a similar affordance would sort of bridge that gap with what learners already are accustomed to and what this tool could do for them. The additional things that they wanted to see were different libraries or files that would affect how the HTML is structured or certain naming conventions. For example, Bootstrap would have a pretty specific naming convention, and it would be important to extract that information for learners as well. And above all, they really just wanted to understand the intentions or choices that were made in writing the code, which does present a little bit of a challenge because we cannot just really ask all the developers to provide their rationale, but they wanted to essentially know why all these implementations are different yet produce a similar outcome, but also want to know why one implementation might make more sense than another for a specific purpose. So the New Yorker might be more appropriate if you're looking for a simple navigation bar, whereas you can see here that NPR has these little drop downs, and that both adds to the length of the code as well as its complexity. So one user might prefer a more complex version, whereas another user might just want the 48-line short implementation of the three. And so one of the limitations of currently in the project, first is really just identifying sites with similar components that people would want to learn from. And so that's kind of a little bit of a laborious, tedious process because I've initially tried to collect a repository of similar components, and it's not often really easy to intentionally look for websites that all look similar or have similar layouts and such. And another one would really also just be, finding ways of correlating implementations or also almost providing like a value judgment as to why one implementation would work better than another for certain things. And so next steps will be focusing mainly on what a user-facing tool would look like. I'm going to leave the crowdsourcing aspect of identifying similar components across sites for a later quarter, but because we're focusing primarily on what learners could learn and benefit from this tool, that will be my main focus. And so that'll mean building out additional UI affordances similar to ones that users have already talked to have suggested. And also really just focusing on how we can understand and recognize choices that have been made in the structuring of code and producing high-level insights from those. And also understanding subtle differences as well as similarities across these implementations. For example, maybe seeing how we can calculate the Levenshtein edit distance for HTML or CSS, and hopefully providing again some high-level takeaways as to why all of these sites either do or do not do the same thing, and then also how that translates into a learner's own project. And so finally, tying all this together, we'll also just be continuing to talk and test with users to really pinpoint additional learning objectives for learners, and why one implementation would make more sense for their own purposes.